Well, again, thank you all for staying in the room at this, for today. I have the pleasure of introducing the next panel on immigration and public health. When we thought about what kind of important overarching topics to discuss at today's event, it was not hard to think of immigration and public health, in part because I am incredibly blessed to teach here with my colleague Maureen Sweeney. So Maureen is going to be participating in the panel, moderating the panel for us, and kind of also playing a little backup for one of our panelists who was unable to attend due to a last-minute family emergency. So Maureen Sweeney directs the the Immigration Law Clinic. I was just in the Environmental Law Clinic last night. That's, I think, where that's coming from. Directs the Immigration Law Clinic here at the School of Law since 2004, so a really long time, with a BA from Wesleyan and a JD from Yale, so you have a Yale colleague on the panel as well. I could read from her bio, but I will actually just speak to you about what I know about Maureen. If there is an issue in immigration law, Maureen has written about it, Maureen has talked about it, but Maureen brings it to the practice. Maureen is an academic for sure. She teaches, she's a great teacher. She actually teaches also in Spanish, which is amazing. But she doesn't just stay up in theory. She brings it down to the ground. So one of the most significant products that Maureen has worked on that I think has had a tremendous impact is getting folks to understand the secondary consequences in criminal proceedings for immigration. Folks who might plead to a minor misdemeanor offense and then are trampled into the immigration courts. Likewise, Maureen and her students are providing necessary representation to folks in immigration court who are not entitled to lawyers, despite being impoverished. They're not entitled to public defenders or otherwise. And so I'm really proud that here at this institution and that my colleague Maureen provides that support to folks as well. So she is also a founding board member of the Maryland Immigration Rights Coalition, a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting Maryland immigrants through the coordination and enhancement of pro bono representation of low-income immigrants. Again, taking it to the street and making a difference for real folks. I'm just going to briefly introduce also the other two panelists so I don't have to stop when folks are talking, but we're really happy to have with us Rishi Sood from New York City Health Department, whose colleague Tom Merrill, wave Tom, Rishi's lawyer is in the room, just in case he says something. No, I'm joking. Tom is a longtime member of the Network for Public Health Law, but Rishi has his BA in medical anthropology, which I had to look up what that was. I thought that was so interesting, and then I wanted to go back to college. So, but my dad said no. So I called him up, and he's like, if you want to, honey, because you're old enough now to go by yourself. And his MPH as well from Case Western. Rishi works on a variety of policy issues, but all designed to improve access to quality primary care for New York City's low-income and immigrant populations. He was the department's lead representative on the mayor's task force on immigrant health care access, and in this capacity, he led the task force's subgroup focused on care and coverage options for the uninsured. His previous work experience includes work at the Prevention Research Center for Healthy Neighborhoods in Cleveland and the Nassau County Department of Health in New York. From our work getting Rishi, it wasn't hard to convince him to come talk about the work that he does, because when you love what you do, you savor these opportunities. But really, his work to make sure uninsured, particularly uninsured young people, unaccompanied minors in New York City are receiving not just adequate care, but good, really good health care, is going to have ripple effects for generations to come. So again, we value the work that Rishi and the New York City Health Department do as well. And then finally, Meha Makhlouf. Okay, I'm practicing, assistant professor of law at Penn State Dickinson, also a JD from Yale, so I thought the two of you would have that in common, and a BA from Brown. She teaches in public health law, in the public health law realm, particularly teaching the medical legal partnership clinic at Dickinson Law, which is near and dear to our heart. The network has a significant relationship with medical legal partnerships. So Meha and her students work within the, with medical providers whose patients need legal services. Because you can imagine folks often present with needing a variety of different services when they're in the medical context. Here at the law school, we also have medical legal partnership, and we also include social work in that, so folks are getting social work services as well. But really meeting people's needs in one kind of package is incredibly important. So again, the work being done at Dickinson with the MLP clinic is incredibly important. Let's see. Amit has also primary research interests lie in the intersection of health, law, and poverty. She seeks to understand how laws impact the social determinants of health. My students recognize that term. And efforts to achieve health equity with a particular interest in access to health care and other health promoting public benefits in immigrant communities. Again, not difficult at all to get her to come today because she's passionate about the work that she does. And again, we had a last-minute cancellation due to a family emergency, and that person was going to talk very specifically about the public charge rule, as well as some other issues. And so the rest of our panelists are going to fill those gaps, and I appreciate their flexibility and willingness to do that at the end of the day. So I'll turn it over to Maureen as moderator, and you can stop hearing from me.
I mean, not that it's great that we're going to stop hearing from you. Good morning, everybody. I am delighted to be here. As Kathy says, I've been doing immigration for a long time. But this is, well, not my first foray into the health realm. I did actually give a talk at Digestive Diseases Week last year. But I'm sort of new to thinking about health consequences for immigrants. I mean, I've always been in the sort of immigration law area of things, just trying to keep people from getting deported. And it's interesting for me and really sobering that I haven't been thinking about the full human consequences for my clients. And so I'm really grateful to be here and to be able to participate with this wonderful panel. What I'm going to do is just sort of set the stage. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of good news to give. We have arranged the panel, so Rishi is going to speak last. I think he's our most good news kind of guy. So we're going to try and end with a positive spin. But the situation, it's no surprise to you to say that the situation for immigrants in our country right now is really dire, especially poor immigrants. We have this rhetoric being sold that immigrants come here and they just suck our system dry and they don't contribute anything, and that we need to just cut that off. What that doesn't recognize, of course, is that immigrants are a full part and have always been, since Europeans came to the Americas, have always been a part of our community. We are family, friends, neighbors. We are all part of one community. And so the health consequences for individuals become health consequences for the community. And the contributions of those individuals are contributions to the community. So it's a much more complex story than we're hearing in the sound bites and on Twitter. One of the consequences, I think, of this relentless barrage of rhetoric and the policy changes that I'm going to talk about in a minute is that we used to have, when I first started practicing immigration law, there was kind of a bifurcation or a divide between people who were considered good immigrants and bad immigrants, right? And I never really bought that divide, and the so-called bad immigrants are the people that I've basically been representing my whole life, who are human beings, complicated human beings like all of us, who happen to not be US citizens, and that carries extra consequences for them. But one of the consequences that we have of this new escalation of anti-immigrant rhetoric is that we no longer have any good immigrants, right? There's no longer, it used to be, so think about DACA, right? Think about the dreamers. These are young people, formerly young people, some are in their mid-adulthood now, who were brought here to the US as children. And so it was no choice of their own, and there was a worry at some point when the DREAM Act movement really got going that this was going to stigmatize other immigrants because you were sort of accentuating that divide between the good, innocent immigrants and the bad immigrants who had made bad decisions. But under this administration, even the good immigrants, the DACA recipients, are in the crosshairs, right? So we have now a situation where we really are stigmatizing and targeting an entire population because of their immigration status and for no other reason. We have just, we're targeting refugees, we're targeting domestic violence survivors. We've just in the last week, we've had both a Grammy nominee and an Oscar nominee who 21 Savage was not able to perform at the Grammys and is being released today, I understand, from ICE custody because he had been detained by ICE. And then one of the stars of Roma has been denied a visa to come to the Oscars. So, even the sort of high-profile people are just being caught in this blanket targeting of people because of their immigration status. And I want to talk just a little bit, just to give a kind of a rundown of the range of directions from which these attacks are coming. On the policy level, we have the executive agencies really exercising their power to their absolute maximum and beyond. In many cases, the courts, of course, have cut off a lot of these attempts to make policy changes. But the rescission of DACA, the rescission of the ending of temporary protected status for many groups from Honduras and Haiti and other places. We have travel bans for nationals of whole countries being banned. We have the general immigration bureaucracy, the agency where you file applications for family petitions or citizenship applications, has been grinding slowly to a halt. I feel like they're just not making decisions. Things are really, really being caught up. They're rejecting fee waivers. This is where we get back to especially the assault on poor people, because there are fee waivers available for many applications if you can't afford to pay the fee. And the fees are, we have a number of clients in our clinic who just need to replace their green card, and that costs over $500. So you've got a homeless 19-year-old, he can't afford to pay the $500. His fee waiver was rejected twice. One of the reasons he's homeless and penniless is because he was in ICE detention for much of last year. So they actually kept him from working and then denied his fee waiver. So the bureaucracy itself is becoming much more hostile. Where the agencies are reinterpreting rules as restrictively as possible. The most high-profile example of this is in the asylum area, of course. The administration sees this as the main problem with securing the border, right, is that we have all these asylum seekers coming and taking advantage of this loophole of our asylum law, which is, by the way, not only part of our statute passed by Congress, but also mandated by international law and our having signed on to the Refugee Convention. But the administration sees it as a loophole because it allows people to stay here and make the case that they're in danger of persecution in their home country. There's a lot of talk of a crisis at the border, right? And there is a crisis. Part of it's at the border. The main crisis, though, is in the home countries, right? We've got a breakdown of law and order in the home countries, and people are being targeted for all sorts of reasons and not protected by their own authorities. And they're going to come. They're going to keep coming. When you have the choice between turning your 12-year-old over to MS-13 because they're trying to recruit him and getting the hell out of there so nobody gets killed, you're going to get the hell out of there, right? And no matter what we do at the border, we're not going to change that. So the crisis is a bigger, more complicated crisis, which I realize we don't like to deal with because they're harder to solve. But it's not at the border. The part of the crisis that we have at the border is because of choices that we have made as a country, as a government, about how to respond to people coming to the border, right? So some of that we could take, say $5 billion, if we wanted to just pull a number out of the air, and invest in infrastructure at the border that would be appropriate for receiving families that are fleeing violence. That could be maybe a good use of that $5 billion, right? Instead, we're talking about a concrete wall, right? So we're making choices. We're making choices not just about, wall or no wall, but also about refusing to process asylum seekers at the border. People for months, people who've been presenting themselves at the ports of entry on the southwest border are being turned away, right? They're being turned away. They're being told, we can only take 15 a day. So you have people sort of massing on the other side of the border, waiting for their turn to come to make their claim, which is protected by international and US law, to seek asylum, to seek protection from the danger that they're facing. So yes, we do have a very difficult, complicated problem, but we're not really heading toward positive solutions. We have an administration and a Justice Department that is trying to rush through cases through the immigration court system to deportation. Something a lot of people don't know is that the immigration court systems are actually part of the Department of Justice, right? We think of courts as being independent, the judiciary, a separate branch of government. That's not what we're talking about here. This is an administrative court that is part of the Department of Justice, and for which the Attorney General can just decide what the interpretation of the law is going to be. It is then, that law is, or those decisions of the Attorney General are then subject to review by courts of appeals. But within the immigration court system, it's all subject to the Attorney General. So the Attorney General has been doing things like trying to control the discretion used by immigration judges, putting quotas on them that they have to process a certain number of cases a day. Or a year, which translates down to the day. Asylum cases are complicated. They take time. And if you're going to do them right, you have to take the time to do them. And you're not going to be able to meet the very high quota that the Attorney General has put on the immigration judges. So they're under very personal pressure for their performance reviews. If they don't get their quota, that's negative for their performance. And especially new judges feel that very acutely. And we see that here in our local court, which is completely overwhelmed and doesn't have the resources to do its job, on top of all the interference that's coming from the AG and the Department of Justice. And of course, we have increasing arrests, and we have pressure from ICE and DHS generally for local law enforcement to become involved in that enforcement, which then creates a lot of distrust in local law enforcement, and not just law enforcement, but institutions generally, including hospitals, clinics, schools, places that people traditionally go for help. So all of these changes take a toll on people, right? There's an enormous amount of stress in the community, and stress, of course, has important health consequences. And this is not just personal stress, but then stress that is communicated, right? So children are worried about their parents. They go off to school in the morning, and they're not sure that mom's going to be there when they come back. I mean, think about that. Think about that from mom's perspective, right? You send your kid out the door in the morning, and you hope you're going to be there at 3 o'clock when they come back. Or you have to get on the road and drive to work, knowing that a large percentage of people that end up in deportation proceedings are there as a result of a traffic stop, driving while brown, which then leads to a charge of driving without a license, which then leads them right into ICE's hands. So that's a lot of stress to live with day in and day out. And that has consequences for parents, for children, for everybody. There are escalated consequences in this climate, and this is why it's a particularly good moment to be talking about health and public health and immigrants. The attempts to rescind DACA, to rescind temporary protected status, those affect people's access to insurance and to Medicaid in some states where DACA has given them the ability to get insurance, so that their access to care becomes an issue. We're going to talk some about public charge. There's a proposal by the administration to essentially limit people's access to green cards. People who qualify to become permanent residents could be denied because of their access or their family's access to certain public benefits, including health insurance, food stamps, really, you know, kind of minimum safety net sort of programs. We have, the administration is also doing active damage to people, right? I mean, the most visceral example of this is the family separation policy, tearing apart parents and very young children with consequences that are going to be long-term for those kids. And so you have just a lot of, and I haven't even talked about detention. There's a whole detention industry, much of which is private for profit, that is not serving our immigrant brothers and sisters well. There are people on hunger strikes being force-fed. There are reports of sexual assault. There are children being locked up for months when that really is to nobody's good interest. And they have a sponsor here who could take them. But the administration is instead dragging its feet on that process. These are all policies that have very real consequences for individuals and also for communities. They also are an opportunity for us. And one of the things I say this continually wherever I go, one of the silver linings of all of this that I see is that people are really starting to pay attention to immigrants and immigrant issues and seeing immigration issues as civil rights issues. So we have a whole level of response, and in the same way that we have individuals responding and lawyers responding, we have communities responding and health departments responding. I was just invited, our social worker and I went down just recently to talk to the folks at our local health care for the homeless because they were concerned about how immigration issues were affecting their patients. So it's just, we're broadening the net and we're helping people to see what's happening in these communities. So today we have some wonderful folks to talk to us about some of these specific intersections of health and immigration. And as I said, we're going to start with Medha. She's going to talk with us about some of the access to coverage, health insurance, and other issues, sort of legal issues. And then Rishi's going to talk more concretely from a community standpoint, from the health department standpoint. How do you, when you really want to reach these folks, how do you do it? Not how do we keep the government from cutting things off, but how do you actually have a positive impact? So we're hoping to end with that, and then we will have a time for questions at the end. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here with you all today. Thank you to Kathy, to Maureen, to Megan, and the Network for Public Health Law for organizing this conference and inviting me here. So the theme of my presentation today is a phenomenon that I'm calling healthcare system avoidance, which is when immigrants decide not to engage with the healthcare system out of a fear of immigration surveillance. So there are many ways in which immigration concerns can act as barriers to accessing healthcare. My presentation focuses on one of these concerns. This is the fear that personal information disclosed for the purpose of accessing healthcare will be shared with immigration agencies in order to deny immigration benefits. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the proposed changes to public charge regulations, which were released in October 2018. Now, personally, I'm interested in this topic because I've seen firsthand the chilling effect that proposed and actual changes in immigration policy have had on immigrant patients of the health center with whom our medical legal partnership clinic partners. So refugees, green card holders, even naturalized citizens, none of whom will ever have to undergo a public charge determination, have expressed concern about accessing public benefits like Medicaid, which enables them to see the doctor. So the problem I'm exploring in this presentation is how to conceptualize this chilling effect among immigrants as a legally cognizable harm, or at least a legally relevant consideration. By the end of my presentation, I hope to have given you a more nuanced understanding of the potential harms that the proposed public charge rule would have if it is indeed finalized in its current form. So I'll begin with an overview of public charge as it currently stands and the major changes that have been proposed. Now, in a 2016 campaign speech, many of you may recall Donald Trump claimed that the United States has become a dumping ground for many other parts of the world. He warned that immigrants were bringing drugs, crime, and infectious disease into the country. These oft-repeated sentiments echo a long-standing fear among those who favor tightening immigration restrictions. Okay? And their fear is that other countries take advantage of us by ridding themselves of all kinds of undesirable people. To avoid attracting immigrants who would become a burden on American taxpayers, the federal government has long excluded non-citizens who were deemed likely to become a public charge. In other words, primarily dependent on the government for support. The current definition of public charge comes from a 1999 policy guidance, and we'll come back to this in detail to discuss what the current interpretation of primarily dependent is. So immigration officials conduct a public charge determination when a non-citizen applies for admission to the United States. So you all may know that in order to enter the United States, you have to have a reason, whether that's for tourism or to visit family or friends, or to work or to study, and so on. So when a person wants to enter the country, they not only have to meet the criteria for a particular type of visa, they also have to avoid the grounds of inadmissibility. There are 10 categories of these grounds of inadmissibility, and public charge is one of them. The other main instance in which non-citizens apply for admission is when they apply to become a lawful permanent resident or a green card holder. Now, I want to note here that a public charge determination is not conducted when a lawful permanent resident applies for naturalization to become a U.S. citizen. And this was actually a widespread point of confusion in the media last year following the release of the proposed public charge rules. Also, certain categories of non-citizens are entirely exempt from the public charge ground of inadmissibility. So when refugees, asylees, and other mostly humanitarian immigrants apply to become lawful permanent residents, their applications cannot be denied on the basis of public charge. That is the current law, and it cannot be changed by regulation, executive order, or policy. In making a public charge determination, immigration officers conduct a totality of the circumstances analysis. So they consider a range of factors to determine the likelihood that an applicant will become a public charge. And one of these factors is the applicant's past or current use of public benefits. The immigration agencies have limited their consideration of public benefits to two categories. First, forms of cash assistance for income maintenance, and second, institutionalization for long-term care. Under the first category, we have temporary assistance for needy families, which is what most people think of as cash welfare, supplementary security income, which is a cash supplement for low-income people with disabilities that is administered by the Social Security Administration, and general assistance, which is a common name for state and locally funded cash assistance programs for low-income people who don't qualify for TANF. So Medicaid is essentially the only public benefit that covers institutionalization for long-term care. Note that there are many other public benefit programs that are not currently considered in the public charge determination, and they are all listed here. So the proposed rule would change this. First, it would actually change the definition of public charge to mean an alien who receives one or more public benefits. Second, it would expand the types of public benefits that are considered in the determination. So, in addition to the cash assistance benefits and Medicaid for long-term care that I mentioned earlier, use of the following benefits would be considered: regular Medicaid with limited exceptions, the Medicare prescription drug subsidy for low-income beneficiaries, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as food stamps, and all of the major federal housing assistance programs. All other public benefits would not be considered, but DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, requested comment on whether additional programs should be included. The proposed rule also provides more specific guidelines on characteristics that should be considered positive or negative factors in the public charge determination. So you see here that public benefit enrollment within the past 36 months would be a heavily weighed negative factor in the analysis. There are some additional changes to public charge policy in the proposed rule, but these are the ones I'll focus on in the presentation. Now, I want to turn to a discussion of how concern for public health has played a role in the development of public charge policy. As you'll see, the proposed rule represents a dramatic departure from the long-standing consideration of public health concerns in public charge policy. Now, the roots of public charge policy go all the way back to the colonial poor laws, the purpose of which was to establish government authority to provide aid to the poor. Now, the flip side of the poor laws was that they also permitted localities to remove outsiders from the territory if they sought shelter or other necessities. Now, at that time, aid came primarily in the form of almshouses, which provided shelter, food, clothing, and all of the basic necessities of life. Fast forward to the founding of the Republic. The colonial poor laws were transformed into state laws governing the entry of outsiders. So these were proto-immigration laws, before immigration law as we know it existed. These laws, too, authorized states like Massachusetts and New York to deport foreign-born people who sought shelter in public charitable institutions like almshouses. Fast forward again to 1882 and the establishment of the first comprehensive federal immigration law. The public charge clause was there. It denied entry to, quote, any convict, lunatic, idiot, or any person unable to take care of himself or herself without becoming a public charge. In 1891, the law was broadened to exclude anyone likely to become a public charge, and that language is still in the statute today, as you saw. Now, I'm telling you this history in order to point out a feature that remained remarkably consistent throughout the long history of public charge policy. And that is that the focus of concern was on people who were institutionalized or otherwise substantially dependent on the government to meet their basic needs. When new public benefit programs were created in the 20th century, like English classes and public health programs, they were not considered relevant to public charge. Rather, their purpose was seen as integrating immigrants in order to promote their long-term self-sufficiency, as opposed to creating dependency on the government. Likewise, with the creation of Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, federally funded housing, and Head Start in the mid-20th century, public charge policy continued to focus only on the receipt of cash benefits or long-term institutionalization. It was widely understood that all of these programs are supplementing rather than fully providing for the basic needs of low-income people. And at that time, there were far fewer eligibility restrictions related to immigration status. Even after welfare reform in the 1990s severely restricted immigrants' access to federal public benefits, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which is the predecessor agency to today's Department of Homeland Security, released a field guidance that clearly stated that it would not consider in the public charge determination non-cash benefits that support nutrition, health, and living condition needs. Their main purpose for issuing this field guidance was to reduce the negative public health consequences generated by the existing confusion, and this is a quote, and to provide aliens with better guidance as to the type of public benefits that will and will not be considered in the public charge determinations. In other words, they were trying to directly combat this chilling effect on public benefits use among immigrants. So the public health rationale has been a mainstay of public charge policy since its inception, even if it was sometimes implicit. In its proposed rule, DHS has ignored this critical insight that has shaped public charge policy, that public benefits play an important role in helping the working poor to become self-sufficient in the long term by addressing social determinants of health, such as access to health care, adequate nutrition, and safe and stable housing. Instead, the proposed rule reflects a different agenda. And this is one that's devoted to slashing enrollment in public benefits programs among citizens and non-citizens alike in the name of self-sufficiency. Now, this is my main contribution to this conversation. I worry that even if the proposed rule is not finalized as it's currently written, the damage has already been done, and that millions of non-citizens who cannot be penalized under public charge will disenroll from or forego enrollment in public benefits for which they qualify. And even if the law doesn't directly affect them, from a legal realist position, everything for them has already changed. There are widespread reports of non-citizens avoiding public benefits use out of a mistaken fear of immigration consequences. These include applicants for naturalization, undocumented parents refusing to obtain benefits for their US citizen children, and recipients dropping out of programs like SNAP that are currently excluded from the public charge determination. Immigrant families are getting a clear message from the proposed rule that if they use the public benefits that support their health, nutrition, and economic stability, their immigration status is at risk. And children face a particular risk, in part because they have more to lose. Non-citizen children are often eligible for a broader range of benefits than adults, but adults control the decision to apply for those benefits. A household that forgoes benefits that help to provide healthy food, safe, stable housing, and adequate health care will put children's health and wellness at risk. As Maureen mentioned, economic and food insecurity exacerbates stress and instability in a home. And when children face such substantial, persistent adversity in early childhood, this is known as toxic stress, it can actually interfere with their brain development. Now, the negative public health effects of the proposed rule go well beyond the households of those who are chilled from accessing benefits. When people disenroll from subsidized health coverage, but inevitably seek health care when they get sick or injured, providers are forced to provide uncompensated care. And these lost revenues can have negative spillover effects into the broader community. If the proposed rule is finalized as written, I'm not sure that even successful litigation will provide a sense of security to non-citizens who are trying to make the impossible choice of continuing on the path to US citizenship or ensuring that their family members can meet their basic human needs. For this reason, anything that healthcare providers and immigrant advocates can do to ensure patients of their rights while accessing healthcare or other benefits is vital. To conclude, I want to emphasize one takeaway for you all. If you're ever in the position of counseling immigrant clients, please remember that there are a variety of federal and state public benefit programs that are excluded from the public charge determination altogether. Also, public benefits use is one factor in the public charge test. It alone doesn't determine whether an application for admission will be granted or denied. I know that there are other advocates who are more cautious about how they counsel immigrant clients on public benefits use, but my experience has been that there are lots of immigrants avoiding benefits that could really improve their health and wellness based on confusion about public charge. And when that's the case, reassuring them that they can continue to receive benefits goes a long way. Finally, feel free to contact me or the clinic if you have any questions about whether a particular non-citizen's use of public benefits could result in negative consequences under public charge. These are 3 of my students. There's 5 more, and they're very eager to address this extremely timely and important issue. Thank you.
On that note of advising clients, I would just point out we do have you will have access to an additional PowerPoint that's largely on this topic with a slightly different approach from Sarah Grusin, who was not able to be here today. But right at the end of that are some links to resources by a group called Protecting Immigrant Families. That are very well designed materials to help educate families and communities about what they should and should not be worried about.
When you're getting technical assistance on IT stuff from me, Rishi, you're in trouble. No, I'm teasing. There you go. Except there's Oh, there it is. There we go.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I am pleased to be here and glad to talk to you about what I hope is at least partially sort of a little more on a more positive note, as Maureen noted, though there is a lot of background here which sort of in order to explain why we've been working on this issue since 2014, which I'll start with, which actually touches on the ongoing crises that Maureen talked about in other countries. So I'll be talking about local policies. I work at the New York City Health Department, local policies to protect and promote both the health and health care of unaccompanied immigrant children. I'll also be touching upon legal services and other social services, particularly education, as a part of the city's coordinated strategy beginning in 2014. So some of you may remember these headlines. These are all headlines from various newspapers from the summer of 2014. I believe they're all from about July and June, July, and August. U.S. deports families to Central America. In court, immigrant children are moved to the head of line. That was in reference to President Obama's administration's what were called at the time surge dockets or rocket dockets to expedite the cases being heard for the immigrant children that were coming in 2014. Something from Hillary Clinton, and then perhaps the most outrageous of everything on here is at the bottom. Ebola fears spark backlash against Latino immigrants, and if I'm not mistaken, this was an article about a congressperson in this country who was claiming that Ebola and other infectious diseases were coming across the southern border. So that's the sort of background. I'm sure that all of you, to some extent, were familiar with this or had seen these in 2014. So behind the crisis, why are the children coming? But there was a surge, which I'll talk about the numbers a little bit. Violence, gang activity, and political insecurity in Central America, particularly in the countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. An ongoing crisis, really. Children and families have been coming since the 1980s, and even before that, but the population in 2014 consisted of more girls and younger people. The average age dropped to about 15 in 2014 compared to the years before that, where it was higher, but then a huge increase in the 2 age groups of 0 to 9 and 10 to 12 particularly. Background from the 2008 George W. Bush era Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which really sort of describes the environment that we were in for people who are not coming from Canada and Mexico and are coming from non-contiguous U.S. countries. So the goal of this 2008 law, a federal law, was to protect children from trafficking and prevent them from being deported into a dangerous situation. It only applies, as I said, to non-contiguous countries, so not to, let's say, Mexican children who are coming into the United States. And what it says is that U.S. Customs and Border Patrol must turn undocumented children over to HHS, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, within 72 hours. HHS will then provide custodial care until that individual is matched with a sponsor, usually a family or a friend. So this is the path that the federal government follows when an unaccompanied child shows up at the border, usually at the southwest border. The child usually arrives, identifies themselves generally to an official, undergoes an initial health screening and an immigration processing to initiate removal proceedings. The child then is usually transferred to a short-term multi-agency center where HHS does provide them immunizations, medical checks, and shelter assignment. They're then transported by the Department of Homeland Security to their shelter assignment. They often remain in a shelter assignment for a period of time until that sponsor is identified, and then, and this is the time when they would, for example, come to New York City, they would be placed with a relative or other sponsor in the U.S., pending the outcome of their immigration hearing or outcome, which this process can take a very, very long time, so they don't necessarily show up in New York City or another city or county in days after they showed up at the U.S. border. So in 2014, nationwide, we had nearly, this was between fiscal year 2014, so between October 2013 and September 2014, we had almost 70,000 unaccompanied children who were apprehended crossing the U.S. border without authorization. This was a 77% increase from the previous fiscal year. Those three countries were the sources of the fastest rise, tied directly to the crises going on in those countries, particularly at that time, can be sort of tied to increased gang activity, increased violence in those countries, with a rise of nearly 400% compared to a couple years before that, and nearly 1,200% compared to 5 years before that, looking at fiscal year 09 to fiscal year 14. This is just another way of showing the sort of dramatic increase. The orange, green, and blue lines show it by country, but then the total number of children and total number of family units shows you that big spike from 2011 really to 2014, and then it went back down in 2015. So to be clear, this is still an ongoing issue, but it was really sort of increased in 2014. So these children are living in a combination of situations when particularly when they get assigned to their sponsor. They could be about a third live with a parent, less than 30% with a family friend, and then a mix of aunt and uncle, cousin, sibling, grandparent, or some very small amount who end up in a state program or in another situation. The outcomes, when we were looking at the decade before, roughly the decade before we started doing this work, really mixed outcomes between who, after they have their immigration proceeding, who gets a removal order, goes through voluntary departure, terminates proceedings, or ends up staying here short-term or long-term. I show this because it's important to realize that as a part of the context of the work that we're talking about, a lot of these children end up being in this country either permanently or for a very long time, which means that they need social services and health care. And so it's not that they are sort of going through those proceedings and then being deported right away. So it was early July 2014 where New York City launched, and there was a number of other cities, including, I believe, Syracuse and others across the country that did sort of a lot of work at the local level to help. But this New York Times article highlighted the task force coordinated by the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs in New York City that said, with surge in child migrants, New York forms task force on aiding them. I want to talk through the process of what we were really doing when this task force was started and what information we were collecting. So it was a task force that included really an alphabet soup of city agencies in New York City. It included the health department where I work, the Department of Education. As I said, it was led by our Office of Immigrant Affairs. It included the Department of Youth and Children's Development, our Social Services Department, various parts of our mayor's office, including our deputy mayor for Health and Human Services, our administration for for child services. Really, we were bringing in any agency that might have any type of interaction or something to offer in terms of what help we could offer to these agencies. We were looking to see first how many children are coming to New York City. I showed you national numbers earlier in the presentation, but we worked very closely. We had a very productive relationship at the time with the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement in the Health and Human Services Department, who was providing us information on a regular basis and who we were talking to on a regular basis about who's coming, when are they coming, where are they going. We wanted to know where in New York City these child migrants would be settling. We were able to do that basically using U.S. Census Bureau maps to see where do Guatemalans generally settle in New York, what about people from El Salvador and Honduras, and we were able to sort of figure out the neighborhoods where these children would most likely be so that we could work with particularly those schools and those health providers. We thought through where they would be encountered by city government. So our Department of Education certainly would be encountering them, social services agencies, community organizations that are not directly affiliated with government, foster care agencies, and in some case, law enforcement agencies. And then our next job was to identify the needs. And so that's where I get to the fact that we did a needs assessment to figure out what are the health, behavioral, and other social service needs. Again, target those by the neighborhoods where we think these communities are predominantly living in. And our goal was to adopt policies to meet health and healthcare needs and social support needs of these children and families. Throughout this process, we sought to ensure appropriate access to health and, as I mentioned, education services. So really, I think the flagship part of our response, which was ambitious in terms of the coordination that it required with the approvals and particularly with the federal government, was the placement, which to our knowledge was the first ever placement of city staff at a federal immigration court. The immigration court in Lower Manhattan serves not just New York City, but also the surrounding area, including Long Island, which actually had more individuals in Nassau and Suffolk counties on Long Island, for those who are familiar with the geography in New York, than in the 5 boroughs of New York City alone. This immigration court actually ends up serving the people from Long Island as well, where there is not a federal immigration court. We placed health insurance enrollment staff from my office at the federal immigration court. They were there for every first appearance court docket. We had a very productive relationship with the folks at the court who were providing us in advance the schedules and the number of children that would be coming and what time their hearings were. The New York City Department of Education staff were also stationed there to assist children and their guardians and parents with school enrollment and to provide information about programs for English language learners. And we worked closely with nonprofit legal service providers to ensure high quality legal screenings. And I want to emphasize this because the New York City Council has done, the New York City Mayor has done, and a lot of groups in New York City have done a lot towards putting resources behind free legal representation. When we did an analysis in New York City of the decade before this, what was happening with kids who did not have legal representation, 85% of them were ordered deported or had a voluntary departure. And when they were represented by legal counsel, 19% of them had that result. So really a huge part of this entire, health aside, a huge part of this was finding representation and getting people to legal screenings, getting them referred to free legal representation. The other sort of large part of an ongoing part of this was a culturally appropriate resource guide, which I actually have a copy of here, which we continue to update and provide in different languages. It's really a book that includes not just information about healthcare, but child and family welfare, housing, legal services, and education. We started this in 2014 with the intent of helping unaccompanied child migrants. It was successful, and we heard from our partners in the community about how much demand there was for it, that we later morphed this into a guide for services for all recently arrived immigrants. So today, this resource guide is not just for unaccompanied children, it's for all recently arrived immigrants regardless of their immigration status. And it's really something that when it's updated on a yearly or a little around that basis, it really is important to sort of get out there in the community. It shows where our clinics are, where our public hospitals are, where people can sign up for education if they're having trouble with the Department of Education, and so on. We advocated for a new identity verification and enrollment process with the New York State Health Department, which was successful. Really, ultimately a small thing in a large system like the New York State Affordable Care Act marketplace, but it took a lot of coordination, identifying the issue on the ground with our enrollers, with the pediatricians who were seeing these people but were not able to bill insurance because they were having identity verification issues, and you can imagine these kids were not coming with the most robust set of documents or paperwork with them. And the State Health Department was very open to sort of changing the processes for these kids because in New York State, as is the case in a handful of other states, we have universal health care access for children regardless of immigration status. So all of these children were eligible for insurance, which is why, I should have mentioned before, which is why our health insurance enrollers at the court were able to enroll them in insurance. And then from a public health standpoint, a letter from our health commissioner to pediatricians, which identified the main issues which pediatricians should be looking out for in terms of these children, both dispelling myths. You saw that headline earlier, but dispelling myths about what are these kids' actual issues, but then also allowing connections and links to best practices. So there was a lot of, and there continue to be a lot of great resources on the CDC's website, on the New York City Health Department's website, about what should pediatricians and community providers do when they're encountering an unaccompanied child migrant. They're generally not bringing infectious disease, but they do often have issues. They need health insurance first off, they have oral health issues, they often have gotten their immunizations, but they need their immunization record so that they're not re-immunized. Lead screening, mental health issues that a lot of them have, and then particular need for tuberculosis screening. I just want to quickly show here, so this was something that surprised us, and this was these were numbers. We saw about 3,500 people in our first year of being at the immigration court. These were numbers that surprised us because 75% of the kids, when they showed up to their first hearing, were already insured. That's good news because it means that when they're going to school, when they're going to their pediatrician, when they go to different places, before they show up for that hearing, they already have insurance. But the number I'm focused on is the 25% because that number is 10 times higher. That is 10 times the rate of the uninsurance rate of kids in New York State. And so we were focused on getting those 25% insured. And then when you look at the adults, not surprisingly, the adults were more likely to be uninsured because many of them are undocumented and they're not good insurance options for that population. But what we were able to do was provide them either direct access to health care in our public hospitals or at our health centers, or for the folks that are documented or did have DACA or some other semi-legal status, we were able to connect them to insurance. Oftentimes they didn't know that they were eligible for insurance and they just happened to be insured. So before, I'm going to talk a little bit about the family separation policy as well. I don't have slides on that, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been done in New York City because of the timeliness of that issue. Before I do that, I just want to sum up this work. As we reflect on the work that we've done, much of it which continues on today, even though the environment has changed, we were able to act quickly in 2014, forming an interagency task force to identify and implement policies to predominantly, from my office's standpoint, support insurance coverage and access to care, but also, as I talked about, other issues in education and social services. The placement of staff at the immigration court was productive. We were able to screen and encounter 3,500 individuals in the first year alone. This was work that went on through 2017 into the Trump administration. The only reason we had to pull our staff from the court was because the court stopped sharing information with us and then canceled a lot of those hearings. And so those hearings are just not happening at the same rate. And so this is work that went on for about 3 years, and we were able to see thousands and thousands of individuals. The effect of universal health care, particularly universal health care for kids, regardless of insurance status, should not be understated. It is very significant. It exists in New York, Illinois, California, the District of Columbia, and I believe, and Massachusetts, and I may be missing a state there, but it's still in a very small number of states. But we should be advocating based on how much we know about kids who have insurance and what care they're able to get for universal health coverage in other states, and that efforts to connect this population to insurance and health care required extensive education, training, and cross-training. In many cases, what we were doing is we were cross-training health department staff on education issues, education staff on health issues, in order to make sure that whoever was having that interaction with the child or family had the relevant information. So I'm going to pivot to talking a little bit about the family separation issue and what was done in New York City over the course of the second half of 2018. Because of the sort of timeliness of it, I don't think that you need to be a child psychiatrist or a pediatrician to know that, and Maureen talked about this a little bit, about both the short and long-term effects in many parts of our communities, but particularly the medical and public health communities were outraged and spoke out against family separation, and that I think helped to put a stop to an extent to it, though it is still going on to an extent. But the city, in really connection with this work that I've talked about, is committed to doing whatever it can to make sure that we're helping. Unfortunately, family separation, and including when kids are in New York City, under care of a foster agency contracted with the state or federal government, the city has sort of limited things that we can do directly. But some of the things that the city was able to do was provide on-site child and adolescent psychiatric consultation to mental health staff that were caring for the children. So the staff at the agencies in New York City that were caring for the children were actually really receptive to New York City government staff coming in to train them. So health department staff, public hospital staff, psychiatrists were coming in and training the staff that were working directly with the children. We reaffirmed the fact that healthcare is available to all children citywide at our public hospitals, and the public hospitals set up an expedited referral and 24-hour hotline so that any child that needed care was able to get care immediately and did not have to wait. There was training available for foster parents and staff at the nonprofit agencies on how to work with kids who had experienced severe trauma. There was increased security at daytime facilities by the New York Police Department and during transportation when they were going from foster homes to the intake centers when they spent their time during the day. The city delivered toys and art supplies, including teddy bears, soccer balls, children's book, and painting supplies, and had weekly recreational activities that were organized, including field trips that were organized for the children to education and cultural institutions in New York City, including museums and zoos. So there is a lot that is out of our control at the local level, including predominantly on the family separation issue, and that is, I think, what made it particularly difficult for local officials who, other than sort of writing letters and speaking out against how harmful this is, weren't able to do too much. But I think what we were able to do in New York City really shows that the sort of coordination of efforts between immigrant affairs officials, hospital officials, health officials is important even when we don't necessarily control when family separation will end. We sort of take the stance that when they are in our city, we need to do everything we can to help them, including connecting them to healthcare. So hopefully some things there are sort of relevant to what you can take back to your jurisdictions as well. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're ready for questions and answers now for our, and I just want to say we all need more teddy bears, don't we? I just love that. Yep.
The first question I have is for the young lady who presented first. When you were talking about the Department of Justice and how they're dealing with with this situation, it appears that there was no law against not doing that. I've never understood how they could get away or doing something like that unless there was a loophole in the law. Was there a loophole in the law that the administration was able to take advantage of, and therefore we had to do a better job in filling in those gaps so that wouldn't happen again? And I think for the second question, is that in terms of the New York City's response to the immigration issues, what is the community's involvement in the process?
Thank you. Let me make sure I understand your question for me. You're asking about whether there was some sort of loophole that permitted the...
It appears that, that a lot of the issues that are coming through from this administration that's currently there is that it seems like there was no law in the first place to guard against that, and no other administration even attempted to do that.
Right. Okay. To guard against the proposed changes to public charge. Right. So, yeah, so the actual statute, the public charge provision is short. It's a sentence or two, and it doesn't. So therefore, there's a lot of room for interpretation by the agencies. And I guess the point of my presentation was really that there's been significant, there's been a need for interpretation of this public charge statute, and it's really been interpreted fairly consistently over the last 100 or so years. And so the statute itself wouldn't necessarily bar the federal government, I don't think, from changing, what some of the current policy is in terms of what public benefits are considered, or if different kinds of public benefit programs in the future are created, for example, that are providing cash benefits. So there's nothing specifically preventing them from being able to modify those regulations or that policy that's already in place. But I think, the point I was trying to make in my presentation is that these changes are such a dramatic departure from what has existed for the last century or so that they are basically barred by the Administrative Procedure Act and possibly under the Due Process Clause as well.
Just on the point of the history there, think about the myth that we have of the person showing up with the empty pockets on Ellis Island, right? That's the American dream. You show up penniless and you make your way. So there is a very long history of interpretation that allows people to rely on family, get some assistance, and make their own way. So, Rishi, do you want to talk about community involvement?
There's a lot there's a fair bit that I talked about that was the government's role and that we needed to do as a health department or as a public hospital system or as an Office of Immigrant Affairs. But the success overall would not have been possible without the community advocates, particularly the immigration advocates that we have in New York that we have a very close relationship with. For example, the resource and referral guide that I talked about, that was an idea that came from them. That went through multiple iterations when we were writing that we worked through with them to figure out what would be useful to the individuals that they're frankly more in contact with than we are. For example, our office, we see these kids to enroll them in health insurance, but other than that, we're referring to a pediatrician or they're at the community organizations. They're not really in contact with the health department. And so the community, particularly immigration advocates, played a really significant role both in the resource and referral guide. Another example is that letter that I talked about, the Dear Colleague letter from the health commissioner to pediatricians. We developed that from talking with pediatricians who are deeply involved in this and caring for these children who could tell us what the needs of these children are. When you actually look at the numbers, there was only about 1,600 children in New York City in 2014. It's a relatively small number of people, and so there's not that many pediatricians that are seeing these individuals, and so we needed to really learn from them as the experts in order to figure out what are the issues. Then we can figure out what are the public health resources, what are the best practices, what are the evidence-based recommendations.
Yeah, you mentioned that public charge is not dispositive in a petition. Putting aside the final rule change, has there been any change in the weight that's been given to it in proceedings that are brought since the Trump administration came in?
Not yet, except for, in the context of admissibility for applicants for lawful permanent residence, not yet. That's what's in the proposed rule. But in terms of applicants for admission from abroad, so people who are applying for a visa to enter who need to, who are subject to public charge inadmissibility, the foreign affairs guidelines have actually changed so that the Department of State staff who are analyzing these visa applications are actually now looking at a broader range of public benefits than they have in the past.
Hi, this question is for Mava. I had a question concerning, so can healthcare providers share information protected by HIPAA for immigration purposes?
Thank you. So this is a really great question. Maureen was going to ask me.
I'm paying close attention because we have a project we're working on this topic.
Yeah, so, right. So I don't think there's like a conclusive answer to this yet, but my interpretation, so HIPAA, it's a really complicated federal framework for protecting health information, right, from disclosure, except in limited circumstances. And it's funny, I always tell my students, HIPAA has only one P in it, and it doesn't stand for privacy. But that's what it's all about. So HIPAA protects protected health information. What is protected health information? It's any individually identifiable information about a patient that's related to the provision of health care. So if immigration status, for example, is provided to a healthcare provider for the purpose of obtaining health care or in any way related to health care, then in my interpretation, yes, it would be protected. But another important thing to keep in mind is immigration status information is not necessarily the most interesting or important piece of information that an immigration enforcement agency would be interested in, right? Because they might know that somebody is undocumented, for example, but they need to know where to find that person. So maybe the address, right, is more important than actually the immigration status. But on the former question, I do want to refer you to the AMA Journal of Ethics, American Medical Association Journal of Ethics, just did an entire issue on care for undocumented immigrants, and there was an article precisely on this point that interpreted it in the way that I do as well.
Excellent.
Yes. Hello, how's everybody doing? Yeah, so when I came in here, I heard a statement about foster care, foster parents. I'd like to know if you can repeat that, please.
Statement about foster care, foster parents? Yeah. What about the foster parents?
Yeah, I just heard a statement about it. I didn't hear it clearly all the way through. I just want to know if you can repeat it one more time.
So I think I might have mentioned foster care twice. If it was in the context of family separation, was it in the second part of, or was it about the 2014 surge of child migrants?
I think it was the second part.
The second part. So it was a reference to the fact that in New York City, what we were doing when the kids that were separated from their parents and who were placed in New York City, in centers in New York City, which were contracted with the federal government, we were able to provide training for foster parents and staff at the nonprofit agencies to work with kids, particularly who had gone through severe trauma, including on their journeys up to the United States. So it was the city providing training to foster parents on various issues.
Do you provide that training here in Baltimore as well?
I don't provide the training in Baltimore, but maybe Kathy can get you to the... Yeah. And if I can certainly ask my colleagues in New York who were coordinating that, and if they have contacts in Baltimore, I can connect you to them.
Other questions?
Yeah, how can we find out the status of immigration issues here in our own state? Is there a place we can go to?
So yeah, I can maybe speak to that. The Maryland Immigrant Rights Coalition, which Kathy mentioned in her introduction, is a local organization, a coalition of providers and interested citizens who are trying to support our immigrant neighbors in Maryland. So they're on the web, Maryland Immigrant Rights Coalition.org, I think is the address. But if you Google it, that will come up. They actually have, I should have this information, but I don't. I can get it to Kathy maybe, and she could post it with the materials. I think they have a meeting open to the public coming up soon, and information. They do periodic information sessions about what's happening, and community organization fairs where people can connect with different organizations that are working with immigrants. There's also an informal coalition called HIJOS, H-I-J-O-S, which is the Spanish word for children, of providers who got together in the wake of the family separation policy to try and make sure that kids who end up in Maryland get the services that they need. So it's a lot of therapists, there's art therapists, there's social workers, there are immigration lawyers, there are all kinds of useful people. And they also are a good resource. So I'll get those that concrete information to Kathy, and you can share it in some way. Another question back here.
And this is a question for you, Maureen. If I understood correctly, you have a immigration clinic and you do deportation defense. with asylum, defensive asylum applicants.
Yes.
How would someone get in touch with you?
Well, let me give you the caveat that we take a very small number of cases because we're working with law students, but my email address is msweeney@law.umaryland.edu, and if you just go onto the law school's website, you can find me there, and
Okay.
I think they have an email link there. So that would be the best way.
Okay, thank you.
It's okay, believe me, we do a lot of referrals. The need for legal services way outstrips anybody's capacity. All right. No, that's it. I just want to thank our panelists who are doing amazing work.
See, I'm lucky to work with Maureen, and it's just crazy that this semester, after working together for now 15 years, we're finally doing a project together. So I don't know why it took so long. I do know why, because neither of us gets out of, our little,
Well, and that's one of those silver linings, right, is that we're having to collaborate more.
So the student who asked the question of Medha was one of ours who's going to be working on this joint project together. So we're all excited that there's an article we can at least start with. So thank you to the panel. Thank you, Maureen, for coming in. So we're going to break out into our breakout groups. Given the time of year for us, it was difficult for us to find breakout rooms that were convenient. So we're actually going to do the breakouts in this room. So when I call your name, breakout leader, come on down, and I'm going to have you say one line about what your breakout's going to be about, and then I'll designate an area in the room for that breakout. So folks, you can leave your stuff where it is if you want, and come down and gather around. These are supposed to be informal. The breakout leader is going to be facilitating a conversation. Hopefully you'll be engaging as well. I will have a law student present in each group to take notes. So if you're facilitating or if you're there and you're just trying to pay attention and not take notes, we will take those student notes and have them available to conference attendees. Not beyond conference attendees, but just to conference attendees. They won't take notes of Susie Q said this and Joe said that, but just, kind of what was discussed and kind of what maybe some follow-up questions might be for us to answer if they don't get answered in the breakout discussion. So on that note, I'm first going to call one of my former students, Elise Grossman. Come on down, Elise. Tell folks what you're going to talk about. One of my favorite topics for later today.
I'm going to be talking about alcohol policy nationally and in Maryland, and with a specific focus on underage drinking prevention policy.
So because we're lucky to have this front area here with a jury box and everything, we'll have Elise situated up here in the front of the room on the alcohol policy stuff. So Liz Geltman, come on down. Liz, my 6 degrees of separation from my law school clinic, Liz is the mom of a former student of mine who is now a practicing attorney who we're very proud of. So Liz, tell the folks what you're going to talk about.
Thank you. So my interest obviously is policy surveillance, and I'm going to talk about two different things. One is going to be a quick update talking about the public health implications of Executive Order 13771, which was President Trump's 2-for-1 deregulatory process. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is what I call financial informed consent, and that is the trend of state and federal transparency policies in terms of health pricing.
Awesome, thank you, Liz. Why don't I put you down in this area over here so folks come see Liz there. Evan Mitchell, come on down. I've always wanted to say it like that. It's kind of awesome. You're the next contestant on.
Hello, I'm going to be talking about legislative priorities relating to public health. So I work in the House of Representatives for Congresswoman Robin Kelly, who is on the Oversight and Energy and Commerce Committee. So I'm going to talk about the committee priorities relating to health and also what bills we're working on related to health.
That's awesome, a little peek into Congress. So we'll have you down here over on the right-hand side here. Francesca Weeks. Do you want to do mini golf or Plinko? Which one would you? I'm doing Plinko because I can't golf. But Francesca, tell the fine folks what you're going to talk about.
Good morning, everyone. So I'll be discussing discriminatory policies and public health law that affect our diversity and inclusion.
So this is our, we're going to go up in the upper corner over here. Folks who are really interested in, kind of pushing back on, when we improve public health, do we improve it for everybody? Because if we're not improving it for the vulnerable populations, then it's not really a public health law, at least in my book, and I bet Francesca agrees. So we'll have that group up there in the corner on my left. And then our last is Deborah Hobson. Deborah, come on down. I just want to note to you guys this before Deborah says what she's going to talk about. We were going to do the round tables with my staff, talking about the stuff that we love to talk about, the work that we like to do. And we were all prepared to do that. And then at the last minute, God bless my staff for indulging me. I was like, wait, wouldn't it be so much better if the participants got to lead the round tables? So if you're wondering why that email came out so late to you, it's because they indulged me in this idea. And I'm excited about it because all of these are going to be, I think, great discussion points, and it makes you be more engaged in the event. So on that note, Deborah, what are you going to talk about?
Actually, I want to go to all the other.
Me too. I know, I'm floating. I get to float.
Yeah. As she said, I'm Deborah Hobson, and I'm not a lawyer. I'm actually a public health expert, and I want to talk about the syndemic of HIV, hepatitis C, and opioids. Syndemic just means simultaneous epidemic. And I want to hear from you, what are some of the legal implications that we need to be concerned about on the public health side?
Perfect, thank you. And so we'll have you up in the right-hand corner over there. So we have until 12:15 for this. We'll see if if you come find a group and you're facilitating. You're talking, and then you're like, but I really wanted to go see this. Feel free to move about the room. And again, I'll have the law students taking notes so that you won't miss anything. And if we see that things are breaking up a little bit early, we can just walk over to lunch. Lunch is not actually in this part of the building, but we'll have people escort you over to where the lunch is. Any questions before we get started? All right, ding, 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 take your places.